Well, he has more than 40 top albums, with 14 top 40 albums with Cold Chisel and 13 charting albums as a solo artist, including 9 that reached number 1. At the impressionable age of 5, his parents told him and his siblings they were going on the cruise of a lifetime. They were leaving their homeland and their problems behind in Scotland, and they were heading to a magical place where life would be better. They sailed for Australia on the SS Strathnava, where they shared a cabin so small it was said their father had to go outside just to change his mind. The family's new life in Adelaide had its benefits, but their problems came with them. His early life was tough and troubled. In the early years of school, he wanted nothing more than to fit in. He made some friends, like the one he found in a paddock one day, a blue-tongued lizard that he took home and freaked all the family members out. He named him Bruce. But the highs and lows were remembered by the songs of the time because it was music that was always there. For a short time, he learned the cornet from the Salvos, while his brother was the school drummer. They learned to sing Aussie Christmas carols like Orana Orana to Christmas Day. And somewhere between that and Australia's other national anthem, Working Class Man, is the story that made him and his music, the man we all know as Barnesy. Please welcome Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy, I want to talk about music, how it influenced your life from a very young age. And one of your favourite first songs was The Lion Sleeps Tonight. Yeah. Is that what encouraged you to just get out there and yell? Were you trying to be Tarzan the whole way through?
No, well, that song was just everywhere. When I came out I came to Australia in 1961, and I remember being in the hostel in about 1962, and that song was on the radio. It was everywhere. It was literally, you could hear it coming out of every hut and every, people walking down the street whistling it and all that sort of stuff. And I liked it, but I had a particular reason for liking it. The time we were in the hostel was a place called Jepp's Cross, which is just outside of Adelaide. And there was a circus set up near the hostel, hoping to extract a lot of money from the immigrants, which wasn't going to fucking work because we didn't have any. But so they set up there, and I remember being, we used to go and sort of hassle the circus, because we were kids. We wanted to run away and join the circus. And when they worked out we didn't have any money, they basically told us to get lost. So we ignored them. But one day I was in the paddock, and I remember seeing like a commotion across the road. There was police cars and all this sort of stuff. And this police car tore into the middle of the paddock where we were playing, and they bundled us into the police car. And apparently the lions had escaped. And I found out later that the lion trainer was a drunk, and he used to hide his bottle inside the lion's cage. And this particular day, he got really pissed, and he used to beat the lions, and they were really skinny. In the book, I think there's some photos of it, but. So the lions seen the opportunity. He was a bit slow when he went to get his bottle out of the cage and ripped them apart. And so I remember me and my mates all celebrating because the lions, got one back. And the lions were actually running through the paddock next to the hostel. And I've sort of got this image of the lions running with their manes blowing in the wind, They were free. They were lions again. They had the blood of their tormentors on their lips, and they were happy. So that really cemented the song as one of my favourite songs ever after that.
You talk a lot about running around in the wild from a very young age. Mm-hmm. You talk a lot also about a troubled home, domestic violence, too much alcohol, poverty. But you talk about your mum and dad in such soft terms as well, and yet there was all this turmoil around you. How do you see your mum and dad and the era they were brought up in? Tell us about how they were brought up.
Well, my mum and dad had a lot of problems, and and booze was obviously one of them. But there was a lot of things that they sort of stumbled into life together. My mum married my father when she was 16. My father was featherweight champion boxer of Britain, and that made my mum the best sparring partner in Scotland. And she, my mum was, if anybody's been to Glasgow, they'll know that the women are probably tougher than the men. My mum was hard as nails, and she stood her ground against my dad. And my dad was battling, addiction to alcohol. We left. He was a I hate to speak ill. My father's dead, by the way. He was a gambler. He was a womanizer. He was violent, and he was an alcoholic. And they were his good points, right? My dad, but he was tough, and he was just doing the best he could. I look back on my parents, and I just think they did the best they could with what they had, you know. They came from a tougher life than I can even imagine. But we moved to Australia to escape all of my dad's problems, and basically they just brought them with them. So we ended up in Australia, in Elizabeth, 12,000 miles from home, with no support. My mum's family went there, so we rapidly became sort of really badly abused. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of sexual abuse. There was all sorts of stuff. You talk about homeless people and homeless kids. A lot of nights I spent sleeping in the paddock across from the house, just because it was safer than being in the house. So this foundation particularly appeals to me because it's helping kids who are probably a lot like me at the time when I was young. And so I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm also really pleased to hear that they don't take any of the money, that it's all going straight to these kids, because it's so important. Because I used to hide in these paddocks and trying to escape the violence and abuse at home, and I was lucky to survive. And so I became I learned at a young age that I had to make people like me if I was going to survive. And one of the ways I learned to do that at a very young age was by singing. And at 4 or 5 years old, I was in the church choirs and stuff. At 5 years old at school, I used to go and sing around all the classes. And I learned that when I sang, people liked me. So I just thought, well, as long as people like me, I'll be safe. So that's basically coming from poverty and violence and desperation, helped me find my feet as a singer. And there's probably better ways of doing that. But singing has been a gift to me since the day I could talk.
One of the things I found most surprising in your book, and I've never spoken to you before, so I just want everybody to know that. Mm-hmm. But you said in the book that you really were the teacher's pet. And having not met you, I would have found that really hard to believe. But there is another side to you, isn't there?
Oh yeah. Listen, I knew I was smart. My family were all my family were smart. I realized that the harder I worked at school, the more successful I was at school. But once again, I was safer. People looked out for me. We were poor. We couldn't go on excursions. I'd go to school without lunch. I'd go to, we'd be dressed by Salvation Army. But if I was the smartest kid in the class, people didn't pick on me. And if people did pick on me, then I just bashed the fuck out of them because I was tough as well. but I learned very young, at a very early age that the more I could take in, the more I could learn, the faster I could get away, and the better it would serve me. So, I was always the guy sitting up the front, trying to learn as much as I could, putting my hand up, getting involved, and the teachers liked it, And I wasn't really the teacher's pet, but I was sort of, I was conscientious. I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow, and I wanted to escape from where I was brought up,
There was a real turning point, wasn't there? Because your mum left, and the kids stayed at home with Dad. That didn't work out too well. No. And then your mum came back.
Yeah, well, my mum left when I was 8. She ran away, and I was really angry with her for a long time. But I can understand. She was, we used to hear my parents coming home from the pub, and they'd be laughing and singing and screaming, and then there'd be fights every night. And we'd quite often sneak out of the bedroom and see my mum lying in a pool of blood in the corner. My dad out womanizing and stuff. So I can understand why my mum left. But at 8 years old, when she left, basically she was the only one that kept it together at all in the house. And so when she left, my father really, really fell apart. And there were 6 kids. I'm fourth in the row. I was right in the middle. And we were left alone to serve our own devices. My dad would get paid on a Thursday. He worked at the British Tube Mills, and he'd get paid on the Thursday, and then he wouldn't come home until the Monday until he spent all the money. And basically, we'd be starving in it when we'd have to go and, borrow money. With my sister, big sister, would steal food from the supermarket to feed us, and we just, it got really, really tough. And my dad would also come back with all these mates when they were all really pissed, and there'd be all sorts of, dodgy characters, people that, I've talked about this on tour, people that shouldn't have been allowed to be near kids we're at our house every night, drunk and with full access to us. So it was really, really, it was very tough. But my sisters did the best they could to try to look after us. They weren't much older than me. So and my brother John Swanee, who's another singer. I remember John ran away from home when he was 13, and I thought Swanee was my hero. See, Swanee was really tough. Swanee could do anything. He actually got kicked out of school in first year high school for beating up his teacher. And I thought he was really great. I thought, that's what I want to be, just like my brother. And then John ran away at 13 years old, ran away to Melbourne and joined a band. And he was very successful. He was playing drums. And I thought he was incredible. It's only recently, when I was writing the first Working Class Boy book, that I spoke to my brother about that and said how much I looked up to him. And he told me the only reason he ran away is because he was being sexually abused at home. And so we were in a really bad state. After about 3 years of not seeing my mother, and really by this point we were covered in rashes and starving, and there was holes in the walls, and there was no furniture. I remember we used to get all our clothes from the Salvation Army and blankets and stuff like that. After about 3 years of this, my mum turned up and took us away. And she came back. She'd met this guy called Reg Barnes, who was Reg was a devout bachelor until he met my mother. And he literally overheard my mum talking to a couple of her friends about how her kids were about to become wards of the state, and if she did find someone to marry her and set up a house for him. And he, out of the blue, just said, "I'll marry you." And he'd only met her twice. And Reg, I remember I met Reg. He came to the house. He was 6'6.5". He was skinny, big nose. He was effeminate. And we just thought, who's this? Who the hell is this guy? We didn't know who he was. And he ended up being the nicest man that I'd ever met. I mean, Reg Barnes, the day that he arrived, I didn't trust anybody. At 11 years old, I was living on the street. I was stealing. I was fighting. I was taking drugs. I was drinking. And Reg Barnes, I remember when he came to the house the first time, he was the first adult that I'd spoken to who actually looked me in the eye and said, "What's going on with you? What can I do to help?" And so Reg, in my life of sort of violence and abuse, Reg was the first person that gave me hope. We moved in with my mum and Reg, and basically I think my mum used poor Reg, to save us. And Reg, Reg and I are close till he died. And Reg told me he knew that, but he didn't care because he just wanted to save us. So Reg was the only shining light in my life. And so at about 12 years old, I changed my name from Jim Swan to Jim Barnes because I just wanted, Reg was my father. Jim Swan was my real dad, but Reg was my real father. He's the man who cared. So that was as much as I was angry with my mum, she brought Reg into my life, which was really special.
When you look back and you think about that, and we're here tonight because of youth homelessness. All of those things that you spoke about, they are the drivers of what leads kids to living a homeless life. How do we stop that? And kids are the future, aren't they? You've got your own kids too. Yeah. And how did you break that cycle? Because kids learn from what they experience around them, and those were habits. Listen, I have 4 kids. Jane and I have 4 kids. I have 7 kids altogether and 13 grandkids. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I actually started breaking the cycle. Prior to that, before I dealt with a lot of the stuff from my childhood, it was just a matter of time until it dragged me down, and my kids just seen me fall apart the same as my parents. In fact, I used to fall apart quite regularly on television, and so they'd see it, Unfortunately, everything I did was in the public eye, so and I got paid a lot of money to do it. So it was quite a. And I got to the point where I actually literally believed
that nobody would want to come and hear me sing unless I was crazy, unless I was wild, unless I was drunk, unless I was aggressive, unless I was, full on. And so it was sort of this self-fulfilling thing where the drunker I got, the more people liked me, and I just thought that was the only way I could make a living. And it took me until, quite a few years ago, maybe around about 2000, to start thinking about, by the time the year 2000 came around, I was drinking at least 3 bottles of vodka a day. I was snorting, 8 to 10 grams of cocaine a day, taking as much ecstasy as I could get my hands on, and I was just absolutely out of fucking control. And luckily, one of the things my parents did give me was a good constitution, because I lived, I lived through it. I lived through it. But at that point, that's when I had to decide to start changing my life. Otherwise, my children were going to go through the same shit again. So I started to break the cycle. But the thing was, to stop homelessness, you've got to do things like this foundation are doing. We've got to, I don't exactly know how to stop it, but I know what not to do. And certainly, slashing funding to families, slashing funding to support for single mothers, for slashing funding to stop helping people in domestic violence situations is not going to do it. So hopefully, with a new election and a new government, we might get something done about it. But I think they've got to put more money into homelessness, more money into homes for homeless people, more money into schools, more money into education, more money into helping young families. I just don't know why. One of the things I remember vividly about Scotland, I was in Glasgow. I started school in Glasgow, and I remember every kid in school got a hot meal at lunchtime. Every single kid got, and Scotland wasn't that, we weren't that well off in Scotland. Every kid got a hot meal, and for most of us, that was the only hot meal we got a day. I think in a country like this, kids should be getting fed. Kids should be getting fed. Kids should be getting, and supported. And I think the only way to do it is to support families from the ground up. I mean, my mum, when she did run away, I don't know what she did. She could have done anything to survive. We didn't see her for 3 years, and she didn't talk about it. But she was trapped there for years. She couldn't leave. There weren't safe houses for her to run away with 6 kids. Without my dad hunting her down, So there's got to be money and thought put into helping women and families, break this cycle themselves, because it's just really, one woman a week dies in this country, from domestic violence. If we think about that statistic, if it was terrorism, we would have armed guards on every fucking corner. But we don't care. We just sort of sweep it under the table, and it continues to go on. It continues to grow. It's the whole Me Too thing is. There's all sorts of different opinions about that. But I don't give a fuck whether you support that or not. But women should not be afraid and being killed in this country like they are being. It's completely off. I feel like I'm on my soapbox now.
I want to talk about the impact on kids, though, because you speak about the fear when you heard your dad coming home, and of course there were moments, you love your dad's your dad.
Yeah.
He would sing like Nat King Cole, he said, but you'd hear him coming home and there was fear, and you'd all run and hide, or you'd leave the house, or you'd think about running away. What does that fear do to a child? And do you still remember that fear?
Well, I remember literally my big sister Dorothy, who was 3 years older than us, used to take all of us little kids and hide us in the wardrobe when they came home. And because my mum and dad would come back with their mates and they'd be drinking and screaming and yelling, and every night it ended the same. And I remember my sister would take us and hide us in this wardrobe. And she'd cover us up with coats and blankets and pillows to muffle the noise, because eventually they'd start yelling, it's Glaswegians, they sing. So they'd start singing first. And then after a few drinks, they would start, somebody's, grab one of the other women's asses or something, and a fight would break out, and it would be all hell would break loose. And then we'd be hiding in the cupboard afraid and trembling, and then it would go quiet. And normally when it went quiet, that's when we knew something really bad had happened, and we'd wait and we'd sneak out, we'd wait and crawl out this cupboard, and every night there'd be just glass everywhere, the furniture would be smashed up, and literally every night of the week we'd see my mum lying in a corner, battered. So as a kid, when you go through that, you just don't. I don't. I'm fairly tough, and I've sort of got a lot of front. I can sort of fool people, but I'm scarred from the day I was 4 years old from all this stuff. I have trouble sleeping. I see a therapist once a week. I tried for 40 years to drink myself to death every night, and it ended up. It took me. It tortured me as a child, and it took me to the place as an adult where I had everything in the world, and I remember, in about 2011, hanging on the end of a rope in a hotel room, and that's what it does to children. It's stuff that sticks with you for your whole life, and it's very, very difficult to deal with. And I'm really lucky that I've got such a great family. I have an incredible wife, Jane, who kept supporting me, kept helping, kept telling me to get help, kept trying to lead me. But in the end, it was me that had to change myself, and I had to change myself not to save my family or my marriage or anything. I had to change myself to keep myself alive, to give anything else hope. So I think as a child. That stuff that scours you for life. And I think if this foundation can help make a kid feel safe, one kid feels safe, then, it's, one kid who's not going to be dangling on the end of a rope, or one kid who's not going to be sticking a needle into his arm. It's really, really, really important work that you're doing here. And it's really important stuff that you're supporting. So I hope you put more money in than you did for the silent auction than you did in the loud one.
Well, actually, there's half a dozen people that have come up to me and said, if they paid money, would you sing?
If they play guitar, I'll sing. No, I can do it. We can work on that. I can do it. 10,000, eh? I don't get out of bed for less than 15.
and we know this, don't we? You
have to speak to my manager, my wife.
He who pays the piper calls the tune, right?
We can work on something.
Tell me about Jane. What difference? So
Jane's my wife's from Thailand, and Jane comes from a good Thai family, a wealthy Thai family. Her father was a diplomat, worked her stepfather. Her mum remarried an Australian, and he worked for the diplomatic corps. And they were moving in and out of Canberra. They lived in Rome. When I first met my wife, she's so exotic. She was so beautiful. I remember the minute I seen her. I remember the absolute minute I seen her. It was 4:00 in the afternoon on November 29th, 1979. And it was in the Motel 7 in Canberra, Jerebarumba Avenue. But who's counting? But I walked in, and she was just so exotic. And I remember, she didn't say a word. She didn't look at me. And I thought, obviously she doesn't speak English, It's a bit racist. But I just thought, couldn't work out where she came from. She didn't say a word and didn't look at me. It was only later that night when I spoke to her, I found out that she spoke 5 languages and spoke English better than I did. So I don't know how. I remember we ended up going to a party together, and I was just completely smitten with her. I was like, my best behavior. I sat with her, and she played Puff the Magic Dragon on the acoustic guitar one night after a Cold Chisel show, and I was sitting there going, this is unusual. But I sat there, and I thought,
what normally happened after?
I just thought, what a girl, what a girl. She's tough, to sing Puff to me. And anyway, and she was just incredible. And from the minute I seen her, I was in love with her. And I stalked her until she went out with me. I used to go around and see her, and there was like all these young guys who had the hots for Jane. And eventually, we used to all turn up around to Jane's place. We were like bees drawn to the honey, And we'd all be there, and we'd all sit around, and none of us would leave till the other one left. And then one night I got there, and as they were all coming in, I grabbed them by the throat, a couple of them, and just like, if you come back again, you're fucking dead. And she started going out with me. So, but Jane is she doesn't know that, by the way. She's an unbelievable woman. There goes the marriage. She's an incredible woman who's a really great mother. Through all the stuff I've told you, but I tried to be a good father for all my life. But there was times when I really did fall apart. Jane was the anchor. Jane was the one who kept together. Jane was the one who kept picking me up when I'd fall down and gave me reason to sort of live. So, and to this day, she's the most incredible girl I've ever met in my life. So she's an amazing girl, and now she sings in my band. She writes songs. She asked me one day, this is how Jane is, right? She's a math student, right? A Chinese math student. She sits there, and she said, "Oh, I want to write a song." And I said, "You don't write songs." She said, "Oh, I want to have a go." And she was walking around with a clipboard, writing numbers and scratching off. And I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I have a formula." And I'm going, "You can't write songs like this, You don't know what you're doing." She said, "I'm writing one." And she wrote me a song that was called Lover Lover. It was my only #1 single. And so after she finished it and it went to #1, I said, "Jane, can you write me another one?" She said, "No, I've moved on. No, I don't do that anymore."
Can you tell us the story about the start with Cold Chisel? It wasn't Cold Chisel then, but a chance meeting with a roadie.
Yeah.
You turn up for, I'll have a bit of an interview, see how I go, sing a song or two, and it was at the Women's Liberation
Hall in Adelaide. Yeah. What happened was I was by about 60, I was 16 years old, and I was in gangs. We used to be in Elizabeth outside of Adelaide, and we were in gangs, and we'd go up to shops and we'd get drunk and fight with people. That's what we did for fun. And I remember being at the shopping centre this night, waiting for the gang to assemble so we could all go out and terrorise someone. And this hippie guy came up to me out of the blue and just said, "Oh, hey man, we're forming a band and we want you to come and try to be the singer." And the first thing I thought was, "Don't call me man, you bloody hippie, But he gave me the address. It was for the Women's Liberation Hall in the centre of Adelaide. He said, "Come down on Saturday and try it for this band. I think you'll like them. They're really good." I don't know why my instinct said I should go and have a go, and I think I wanted to get away from gangs. I wanted to get away from violence. I wanted to get away from Elizabeth. I wanted to get away from my life. So I thought, who knows? Maybe this will be a key. And I went down to the Women's Lib Hall, and I remember these guys. They were once again from different worlds to me. I walked in and I literally I think I'd been up all night the night before, and I was just I was there, and I thought, if they don't like me, I'll just belt one of them, But luckily they liked me, and I sang, and as soon as I heard them sing, I heard them play. It was the best band I'd ever heard, So, and certainly the best band I'd ever sing with. So I joined this band at 16 and a half. And we left Adelaide, and Cold Chisel literally took me away from all this past, and that's part of the reason why for so long I was okay, because I was escaping my past, but you really don't. It's like my parents running away. I didn't escape anything. I took it with me, and of course, as probably most of you have seen, by halfway through Cold Chisel, I was drinking as much as my father ever did, and I was probably much worse than he was. So. It was Cold Chisel saved my life for a while, and then it became life-threatening, and we had to sort of break up in about 1984. And I think we broke up in 83. Sorry, we broke up, and we reformed again in 97. And I think over that period, I got a chance to realize what a gift Cold Chisel was to me, and how important they were in my life. And now, after 1997, when we got back together, the great thing about Cold Chisel, I was sitting with Peter Garrett, from the Oils. We're talking about bands like his band and my band. We've been together for 45 years, and it's great. We can pick up anytime we want to go and make music. We can both walk in and do it, and we've got the best jobs in the world, I think. Besides,
Peter Garrett might be next year's
my dear friend. Peter will sing with me too. That's really going to cost you.
I'd pay just to see him dance.
You should see me dance.
So, tell us about the trade and the craft of music, because it's everybody's dream, isn't it? Especially when you're young. Yeah, join a rock band, travel the world. Everyone's at your feet.
Yeah,
crowds are applauding, but it's also hard work.
Music's a lot of hard work. I mean, people like Charlie Watts from the Rolling Stones summed it up. People think rock and roll is glamorous. You spend 22 and a half hours of the day schlepping around, in the back of cars, getting bumped off flights, staying in bad hotels for that 1.5 hours a day where you get to play music. And making music is great. I joined the band when I joined the band when I was 16. Really, it was get away from Elizabeth, chase chicks, have a good laugh, and all that sort of stuff. It was just like I was just a teenager. But very quickly after joining Cold Chisel, and especially because of the soulfulness of these guys, I learned that music was much more. The music was so important. So I found that singing gave me, it was the only time where I could be myself. Where I could get up and I could release, anger. I could release fear. I could release shame. I could release love. Those emotions. I could let them loose on stage, because on stage I was safe. If I'd let anybody see any of these other weaknesses of mine when I was off stage, particularly when I was in Elizabeth, somebody would have belted me, So I found that singing was my safe haven. It was where I could, as it always had been, really, when you look back on it. But music's an incredible thing. I've been lucky enough to sing in a band with Don Walker, who's a great songwriter. And Don, I always thought, for years, I thought Don had been reading my mail, because he'd bring in these new songs, and I go, it's about me. How did he fucking know this, And it's only just recently I've realized that everybody in Australia thought Don was right about them, and most blokes who were Cold Chisel fans thought these songs were about them. So music has a way of making you feel a part of something. It makes you feel included. It makes you feel that you're worth something, and it certainly did to me. And so I go out every night. My job when I go and sing, and this has been my job description for as long as I remember, is to go out and no matter what's going on in an audience's life, for the hour and a half or 2 hours that I'm on stage, I don't want them to be thinking about whether they're going to be able to put food on the table tomorrow. I want to give them an escape, My job is to make people think that every night of the week is Saturday night. And I can't think of a better job to have, because, if you can get people to forget their problems for a little while, that's a really good thing, because there's too many problems in the world.
One of the other areas that does do that is sport.
Sport does that too.
I know that Scotland's not all that big a cricketing nation, but they're a big footballing nation.
Well, in Glasgow, you don't want to give people lumps of wood. It's not a good thing, Really, because we're not going to be used for sport.
I've always been impressed at those from Scotland who turn up to the World Cup even though their team isn't playing.
No,
and they are having the best time. They are the best fans, but I've only seen them when they're still singing.
But Scotland, they love sport. They do. They don't play cricket
Well,
particularly well. I think there's a few. I think they've got a cricket team now. I think they're getting better.
And they're on the way up.
Yeah, good.
But tell me, I want you to tell me this story about the time one of your uncles, I think, hopped on a train and went down to England because it was Scotland playing England.
Yes.
It's a great story. And the one time that, the Scottish fans aren't at each other's throats because they're all in unison.
Yeah, well, I came from Glasgow, and there was two teams in Glasgow. There was Celtic and Rangers, a Catholic team and a Protestant team. And it was like really violent, desperate bloody, competition between these two. And so the only time these fans ever, put up with each other is when Scotland played. Because then they could both, especially if they played against England, because they could both hate the English, you see. So my uncle went to Wembley, the old Wembley Stadium, to see Scotland play England one time, one of the rare times where Scotland won. And he was, this particular game, the Scottish fans, because we won, invaded Wembley, and they broke the goalposts down, they tore up the nets, and they ripped the pitch up. And they took it home, back to Scotland with them. And my uncle told me he was sitting on a train heading back to Glasgow after the game, drunk, happy but drunk, and somebody came up and gave him the penalty spot, and he had it, he treasured it forever, So the Scots were fairly enthusiastic, fans, and if we do get a win in cricket, we're going to be the most outrageous, cricket fans ever.
I'm glad it was only you tonight, not your family on the SCG turf. Let me put it that way.
We won't touch it. I promise I won't touch it. I'll leave it here.
I just want to finish with this one quote from your book. You said, "I used to wonder how I got like I am, but after writing this stuff down, I think I'm lucky that I joined a band and didn't end up in jail or dead."
Yeah, but it's funny, because I do see a therapist every I don't know why. I do see a therapist every week, and I remember after seeing my therapist for a couple of years, and he got to know me and learned what I'd been doing and what I'd been up to. He said to me, I think it's probably a good thing that you joined a band, because if you weren't, you'd probably be a serial killer. Yeah, so I think music saved my life in so many ways. I mean, music really, it took me away, even before I joined a band. But as a kid, music, you know, I could hear music and not hear the violence that was happening in our house. I could sing in my head and not think about the abuse that was happening to me. I could run away from home and sleep in the paddock, and I was scared of the dark, but I'd sing to myself to keep myself, you know, from being afraid. So music saved my life from the time I was 4 years old until, what time is it? About half an hour ago. But I'm just really lucky that I mean, a lot of people don't get, you know, I think to have a career in music, you can ask Peter, you can ask anybody this, you need a lot of luck. And I was lucky enough that I met a great bunch of people, you know. I was lucky enough to meet, you know, Cole Chisel. And I just sort of, I really don't take it, you know, for granted. And I'm happy that I'm here, happy that I'm alive, and I'm happy that I'm still, you know, being able to do what I love. So
we're so happy you're here, Jimmy Barnes. Thank you. So for $10,000, will you sing for us?
15.
15. We've got. Do we hear any more?
I can only do a cappella. We haven't got any instruments, so.
Peter. Up you come.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll sing you a song that my dad. I literally, this is a true story. I remember one of the only things I could do with my father, because my dad was always recovering. He was always hungover, and he used to like sit and watch TV, and that way we didn't have to talk to my mum. And one time I was sitting with my dad, and we watched a movie. It was called Imitation of Life, and this movie was about a young black girl who had very pale skin, and she was pretending she was white because she was ashamed of where she came from. And I remember this movie stuck with me because I was really ashamed of how we were living. And I was sitting watching the movie. At the end of the movie, this girl's mother dies, right? And I thought it was sad. And I was only young. I was eight years old, and I sort of wished I was watching a Western, but I put up with it. The black church, they had this funeral, and at the end of this movie had this woman singing, and I remember I sat bolt upright in the chair, and I heard this woman's voice, and it touched me, and I thought to myself, who the hell is this? And at 8 years old, I sat and waited for the credits to roll so I could find out who was singing, and it was a woman called Mahalia Jackson, right? And I remember, this is true, at 8 years old, I sat and I made a little note to myself, when I have my first daughter, I'm going to call her Mahalia. And I did, and so I didn't tell anybody for years. But Mahalia Jackson sang for the glory of God, only for God. Right? But she was just the most powerful singer, and is the most powerful singer I've ever heard. So I can sing you a little bit of one of her songs.
That'd be fantastic.
Without a warm up. In the upper room where Jesus trust in his faith and power daily there my sins confessing, begging for his mercy sweet. Trust in his faith and power. Seek him there. His love and prayers. It is there. I feel his spirit as I sit with him in prayer. Thank you very much.
special night. What a special rendition from a special man. I think your music's been the soundtrack of most of our lives for a big part of it, and what a great Australian you've been. After we had Warnie last year, we thought, well, how the hell are we going to top that? Peter Lawler came up with the idea that we should approach Jimmy and gave me the connection to John Watson, Jimmy's manager, and I sent John a message, and I reckon it took about an hour to get a message back that Jimmy would love to do it. Mate, you're a champion, and we're really appreciative of it. Really appreciative of what you've done. I think your life story is a great example of the difference that we can make. If we can help one person who's had the sort of life that you started with to get on track and use their talents, whatever those talents might be, to make a difference in the world, then we'll have done our job. It's a bit insignificant, this little thank you from us. It's a game of golf at the New South Wales Golf Club, which is not insignificant, but it seemed, but we would love you to accept that and enjoy the game of golf. It's one of the great golf courses in the world. Yeah. And again, thank you very, very much, mate, for everything you've done and for all you continue to do, because I know we're not the only group that you've helped, and for us to witness what we've seen tonight in just that last few minutes is fantastic, mate. Thank you.